Hello friends, Freeman here. Long time no see, or rather, not too long at all. I uploaded not too long ago by my standards, so I figured that this one should come up fairly soon as well. So what is it that we are looking at today? Well, let me tell you about it. Today, my friends, we are doing another story video. But this is a bit of a different one. I say that about a lot of stories, but everyone has their own little thing, so I guess why not? But what makes this one different? This one is different in the fact that, whilst it is a D&D video, it is a proper horror story. Not one about a terrible player doing terrible decisions because he's an ass. No, we're talking about scary events, disturbing events, all surrounding scary or disturbing themes. I was supposed to originally upload this at Halloween, but sadly I was unable to do so, as other videos took precedence at the time. But I still wanted to upload this because I asked in my Worgen Keen video who would like to hear this little story, and there was a decent bit of people that seemed to want to hear it. And even though you may not have asked for it, I thought, why not give it a try? Scary videos is nothing I've done in a long while. So, let's do so. Today, I'm telling a horror story that takes place from my own personal campaign. It's still currently ongoing, and the players are still pretty satisfied with the campaign. But the events at the time, oh, you will hear it. Everything you're about to hear was an event that took place over the course of a 6-hour game. Quite lengthy and quite taxing. But at the end of it, yeah, it was quite the story. At the very least, I can say that. So, before we start, I just want to alert you. This is not for the faint of heart. I am not saying that to create a scary effect. No, I am genuinely saying that this is a bit disturbing. It might be on a topic that you consider a little bit too close to home. And as I don't want to necessarily spoil the events of the story, I still want you to understand that there are some very dark things happening. So, if you are willing to hear that, then continue at your own risk. 3 days. 3 accursed days the party had been travelling across this damned desert. There was nothing but scorching heat during the days, and silence and constant eeriness around the night. It was downright impossible to get a moment of respite. But the party had signed up to go for this mission, so they had little to no choice. They were signed up to go to a place known as the Orion Hills. In this place they would discover a jar that they were looking for, containing organs to a mummy lord that they were serving under at this time. Requiring the organs for a very important ritual, they would make haste to find it. However, they were quite tired of continuously travelling across deadlands with nothing but sand. So, they decided to do a bit of an offshoot. An offshoot that one of the squads particularly found to be very mixed. Lazuli was a water genasi. She was not as fond of the desert as a fire genasi, rather the absolute opposite. She found it to be nothing but annoying, and the constant heat was getting very annoying for her. She rarely spent a day outside, and primarily sat inside of the cart. With a few exceptions when she was talking to her friend, the tiefling, and warlock, Dorian. Dorian was less bothered with the heat, as he was not as biologically impaired as that of Lazuli, being a literal water genasi in a scorching desert. However, he had problems of his very own. Dorian was a drinker, and he did fancy his drink, and let's just say that going from drinking every single day for 6 bloody years to absolutely nothing, after promising Lazuli to simply stop, well, let's just say it didn't really help that a scorching hot day usually can be enjoyed with a cold one, a knowledge that would continue to pester him. The third character in the party was the human ranger known as Sam. Sam was not particularly old. As a matter of fact, he was the youngest man of the party, barely reaching the age of 18. Sam had not had a particularly nice life and had been living most of his time in the scorching desert, so while he was not particularly bothered with it, he still saw it for what it was, a bloody desert, and they are annoying. And regardless of what one would say about the matter, 3 days in a desert is still 3 days in a desert, with all the trouble and problem that comes with it. Over the course of their journey, they decided that they for once actually wanted to meet people. They had been setting out from the capital city of Dunas, owned by an undead pharaoh known as Kartep. However, they were not particularly fond of Kartep and wanted to meet actual people, and the people of Dunas were not particularly talkative. So they made their merry way towards the only place that was nearby their location that they needed to be in order to meet actual people, and that was the village of Tetr, a village that was the hometown of one of the characters, Lasselie. Lasselie were kind of split on the feeling of going back to her home village of Tetr. Whilst it was her home village, most certainly, she always felt a little bit stuck out. She had never met another of her kind, and as far as she knew, there wasn't really any other water genasi on the entire continent. Not only that, but she had left the village for very personal reasons. Lasselie came from this village, a village that once in time was under attack by the undead, which is why she was so uncomfortable being around Kartep, who, surprisingly to her, was not a cruel undead. Regardless of being cruel or kind, Kartep was still undead, which made Lasselie rather uncomfortable. Lasselie's return to Tetr, however, was made uncomfortable not because of that notion, but because of the reason she had left in the first place. Lasselie had left her home village because there was nothing left there for her. 2 years ago, she had left. And right around the time she had left, a raid had happened to her hometown. A raid made by undead. A raid that left her adoptive mother dead. Several houses had been set on fire, and one of those that had been on fire was that of her mother's house, which had burnt down, and she was dead. After this, Lasselie thought to herself that there was little reason to remain in Tetr, and wanted to leave, to see what the rest of the world might offer. There was, however, one person still binding her to her home. Her best friend, Taran Urias. Taran was a man who was not much younger than that of Lasselie herself. They had grown up together in the village, and had become the greatest of friends. And he had a wish that one day he would be able to get out of the village of Tetr and become a knight, to travel the world and help those who would need it. And for that purpose, he trained a lot, to make sure that he could get as strong as possible. But sadly, an accident happened. An accident that would make it impossible for him to become a knight. And in the accident, Taran lost an arm and a leg, leaving him effectively crippled. After this, Taran never really became the same. He was a little bit of a melancholic figure. Understandable, considering. This, however, was growing very hardly on Lasselie, and she knew that even though she had nothing left to stay for here in Tetr, she really did care about him. She was like a brother she never had, and loved him immensely. Sadly, however, she knew that this could not keep her down. She had to find her own path and make her own life. But she made a promise to Taran, that one day she would return, to tell him of the great journey she had had, and bring a lot of gifts. Even though he was complacent in her doing this action, she was still feeling his heavy voice, his words sinking into the ground. After all, these were the very things that he himself wanted to do, something that he really desperately wanted to have done. But because of the fact that he had such poor-made prosthetics and no one really had the knowledge of how to make better ones, he would become nothing but a liability when traveling through this harsh desert. And when she had as little as she did, it would be difficult enough for her to feed herself, and to bring him along would just be a death sentence for both of them. Which became a very difficult decision for Lasselie, but one she eventually made. And now here she was, on her merry road back to her home village, to see him again, to tell him of the journey. A journey he could not have shared. Dorian, however, was trying to comfort her, was trying his damnedest to be as upbeat as possible, to tell her that things would be fine, joke here and there, and try to make her smile. A very kind thing for him to do, and something that he genuinely wanted to do because he had gotten a sort of care for Lasselie, a care he had not felt for a very long time. Dorian, you see, used to be a husband. But he has lost his wife, and ever since the day he lost his wife, alongside with children, he had never been the same and turned to drinking. When there was so little a purpose in his life, he simply didn't care about what people thought of him, and he did as he pleased, and whatever he chose to do was what he would continue to do, and no one could have told him otherwise. Besides Leslie, who had managed to tell him otherwise, because Dorian had developed a sense of care for her, a care he did not have for most people in his life, and because of how rare it was for him, he cherished it, and therefore tried to appease her. Sam, too, tried to calm her down, but he would not be as effective at it as that of Dorian. Sam was a little bit of a hardened individual, for whilst he did care about her, he did not have a simpler way of trying to express, well, grief for her cause and understanding of her situation. Reason as to why was because he was a simple man in a different manner. He did not express emotion in the same vein. It was more along the line of, if I care about you, I will show it to you through my actions, not through simple words. And because of that, it was a little bit harder to maybe get a hold of in terms of the emotional status, but that did not mean that he was uncaring, or did not bother for anyone but himself. Leslie understood this, however, and appreciated both of their attempts at trying to make her feel happy. But regardless of their attempts, there was more lurking in the backdrop. Yes, the town would be a bit of a bad place to return to, as such scars as losing your mother in a fire will never truly heal. But there was more to it. Something a little bit more sinister. Leslie and Dorian had a little bit of a problem with them. A problem that they both had shared since a while back. Nightmares. Divinely inspired. The nightmares in question had not started too long ago. The reason they had probably happened, as far as Leslie was concerned, was when Dorian had found a strange ring in a hollowed-out tree. The ring in question looked a little bit strange, but he put it on her finger without her being able to react, and ever since, both he and her have been having strange nightmares. What was so strange about these nightmares was not necessarily the nightmares themselves, but rather the origin of those nightmares. The speechless, the darkness, the god of nightmares and visions. Nox. Nox is not a benevolent entity. He interacts with everyone that he has ever gotten in touch with, and Leslie and Dorian were the ones that he had gotten in touch with. In the most literal sense of the word, when they had wore his ring without knowing what it was. The only one not wearing it, however, was Sam, and was therefore spared his nightmares. The strange entity known as Nox appeared to them in their dreams, and was the only thing that was ever consistent. A writhing darkness with no true form. And the only thing that was true about Nox was that of his 5 eyes, looking like that of full moons, with uneven black slits going through each of them. The eyes were also always located on the same place, adjacent to each other, like that on the tips of a pentagram. And just like there will always be 5 tips in a pentagram, there will also always be 5 eyes on Nox. Unfortunate then that I do not have a picture so I can show you. Oh well, the dreams they were having were quite horrifying, and Leslie had them at a higher frequency than that of Dorian. For the past 3 days, she had had the same nightmare. The nightmare in question was her standing on top of a hill overlooking her hometown of Tetr. As she was looking down on the town, she noticed that smoke started to rise from the town, like that of a fire. She went into the town and noticed that there was more smoke, but she couldn't see where the fire was. Cinders rose above rooftops, but she could not see where there could be any fire located. She even heard screams all around, but she saw no people, not a single individual running. She ran all across town to try and find where there was a fire, until eventually she found it. A familiar building that she recognized had burnt down. alongside with a familiar hand sticking up from the rubble. And as if that was not enough, the skies in her dream had 5 moons and no stars. The dream had been consistent throughout those 3 days, and she did not know truly what they were, but she had a guess. She knew who Nox was, and she deduced that this was Nox digging into her mind, finding her repressed memories, and simply playing them back for her, only to taunt her and haunt her as she was making her return to that very town. 3 days and 3 nights in this accursed desert. And what hell it had been. The 4th day had come, and with the 4th day they saw Tetr. Luckily for Lazuli, she did not have any nightmares that night. She had slept very quietly and peacefully for once. She made her way back to the village at long last, and upon arriving into the village, she saw just how badly the drought had caught them. The accursed desert had reached its way here, even to the coastline, where the town was located. And they had quite the difficult time. The village had not grown at all. It had been stagnant, potentially even losing members over the course of the time. She did not recognize any new faces, no new structures or anything. It was just the way she had left it 2 years ago. No one had even tried to leave this accursed place to find another home elsewhere. But people who lived in Tetr were very homebound and didn't want to give it up. That's why she was looked upon quite strangely as she came back. Although no immediate comments were made, she knew what they all thought. Oh, she's still alive. It was quite embarrassing for Lazuli, as you can understand. As they made their way through the village, they made their way to a place that Lazuli recognized all too well. Her home. Her mother's house. Even though a significant portion of the house had burnt down, not all of it had disappeared in the blaze. Luckily, a few of the important bits had still remained, which was what she called the tower. The tower was essentially a small 3-story building that went up and up, with each of them having a small room for their very own. One of them was Lazuli's old rooms. At the bottom, however, there had been some serious changes. The place had been turned into a shop now, and she did not recognize the shop. It was apparently a flower shop, but who owned it, she didn't know. They stopped the cart and decided that this would be the place to stay for now, to see who actually lived here nowadays. She went in to discover that the one who actually lived there now was her aunt, or more should I say, her mother's best friend, whom she considered a sister, and in return, Lazuli had considered her aunt. Aunt Mai. Mai was very pleased with seeing Lazuli. She had been gone for 2 whole years, and she hadn't seen the sight of her, and of course, hugs and kisses all around. Eventually, the other 2 boys came in, Dorian alongside with Sam. Both said hi to her, and they decided that it was time to have a little bit of a good reunion. So Aunt May decided to make a table for all of them, where they would have some nice tea and cookies, just like the old times. It was very wholesome for a change, finally meeting someone that she actually wanted to talk to for a change, and not just some local that she had met back in the time when she lived here. She and Aunt Mai, Dorian and Sam were talking about all manners of things, old history about the town, alongside with a lot of stories about Lazuli's upbringing and the interesting things that she usually did. They talked for hours on end and had a good time with cookies and tea all alike, until eventually the question was brought up by May if she would go and visit her friend, Taran. And this was a question that made Lazuli feel uncomfortable right off the bat. She knew she couldn't avoid going seeing him, so she simply said that she will, later. But it wasn't decided on when. They came to Tetr to rest up for a few days and actually have a good time with actual people, and that was what they decided to do after all, so she would have no shortage of seeing him. It was just a question of when. Lazuli, however, still felt very poorly about what she had done. She did leave the place because she had nothing left, truly, but It was feeling so shameful that she had left her best friend in this place, only to rot away and have none of his dreams ever fulfilled, all because of his unfortunate injuries that had caused him as crippled as he was. She felt very sorry for him, and was kind of scared to even come up and meet him where he lived. So she waited, and decided that for the night, that was not what they were going to do. Instead, she was going to go to the tavern, and see if it was like she remembers it. The tavern was named the Nether-Sea Tavern. It was a cozy little place, clearly a local bar with its own little traditions and whatnot, and not much in the way of supply, granted, but what was there was solid. It was an enjoyable little place, and something that felt very homey. A place she had spent most of her good times, and a lot of good times as well, with Taran. She did not know if she was going to see him there, but at the very least, if he was going to see her there, it would be a little bit more of a casual environment to pick things up at, rather than at his house, just the two of them. She also really wanted to show this place to Dorian, something that Dorian was feeling a little bit miffed about, only from the standpoint that whilst it was nice to see a tavern, it was just unfortunate that he couldn't take from the delights of said tavern. So he simply went along because she wanted it, and he was not feeling particularly great tonight. They worked their way through town as the sun was settling, and made their way to the tavern. They were talking and laughing as they made their way to the tavern, and so she opened the door and simply went in, without looking where she went, and crashed into someone. Both her and the person she bumped into fell to the ground. Upon looking up at the person, she got a little bit of a shock, for that was not someone she recognized. This was a fire genasi. The fire genasi looked up at her as well, and was quite surprised to see another genasi. Just as surprised as she was, in fact, to the point where she was not even certain what to do in this moment. They both stood up and, for just a second, put their hands on each other. And as they did, they both lit up in a strange text on both of their skin. It was as if though it was written all across them, but they couldn't make out what it said. They didn't understand it. All they could note out was that there was some form of primordial, but some strange dialect. They couldn't translate it. Now this was special. Leslie had never in her life seen another genasi. She truly thought she was the only one. She knew that they were a thing, that they existed, but they weren't around here. That none on the continent had ever been born, and was a little bit of a strange thing. Genasi around the world had been existing, but on this continent they had not appeared, simple as that. Which was a little bit strange, as they were simply forces of nature that could appear a little bit here, there, and everywhere. But on the continent, they had simply not appeared at all. It was a little bit of a strange thing for Lazuli, for this was something that, most certainly, had not happened in her life before. They both immediately got each other's attention, and frantically talked about each other's backstory and upbringing. Lazuli had felt a little bit strange about the whole location, considering the fact that there had not been any recognized, or at the very least, noted in any official records, about any genasi births across the continent. However, what she did note out was how they both were born, as they were a little bit of a sort of similar circumstance. Lazuli did not know when she was born, but her mother told her that she had been found in a puddle of water during a rainstorm. She was taken inside by Lazuli's now adoptive mother and taken care of until she became the woman she is today. As for the fire genasi, however, things were a little bit different. He was found in a burning building, and he was rescued by a very poor couple. Sadly, they did not have enough money to feed another mouth, so they were about to put him out on the streets. They did put him on the streets, but he had been able to take care of himself at that point in time, to the point where he had learned how to handle instruments and started to play for tips on the streets. He had also become a little bit of a bar fighter, so whenever he needed some extra cash and the money from playing the lute didn't work, he would try and beat people in bars. He had traveled to Tetr in hope of gaining a little bit of money, but, well, with little luck so far. Their upbringing were strikingly similar. Both abandoned children, not knowing anything about each other's parents, and both raised by adoptive parents. Or at least, more or less. Lassie and the Fire Genasi sat and spoke for quite some time. She learned his name. His name was Ifrit. They sat in the tavern and talked for as long as the hours could count, causing Dorian to be rather upset. Dorian was not particularly fond of the Fire Genasi she had just bumped into, and was feeling rather bad tonight. Since they first spoke, Dorian had not taken a big liking to the Fire Genasi, mostly because Dorian was a bit of a sassy man, and very few actually responded back to his sass. This was a man that did sass back, and because of that, he was not particularly fond of him. Worst part was, he was feeling pretty shit tonight. So after being outwitted for the 5th time at this point, Dorian had enough, took up a beer bottle, and smashed the Fire Genasi in the head with it. The Fire Genasi rose up and was just about to beat the living snot out of him, until Lassie simply ran around as quick as the wind and paused the Fire Genasi. She had an unearthly ability to calm him for some reason. Usually if this would happen in the bar, Ifrit would have gone up and beat them without any problem. But in this occasion, he actually sat down, listened to what she said, and just didn't bother. She, however, would deal with this, she promised. She talked to Dorian, and she noticed that he was acting very strange. And Dorian simply commented that he didn't like the look of the guy, and that was enough for him to do what he did. Dorian was not really having it tonight, and Lassie was not having his behavior. So Lassie told him to fuck off. Dorian turned tail a few seconds later and walked out. And as soon as he walked out, Lassie simply turned back to the Fire Genasi and apologized profusely, and said that maybe it was better that they spoke more in private, so that they actually could check what the text meant on their bodies, to hopefully get more answers for each other. So she grabbed her hand and wanted to go upstairs, and as soon as Dorian had walked out the door, he turned around to look inside, and through the window he saw the Fire Genasi being grabbed by the hand by Lassie and led upstairs. Up until this point, I just want you to understand, Dorian was suffering from alcohol withdrawal syndrome, and quite extreme ones. And because of this, he had to roll saves, with this advantage, that he constantly failed throughout the entire evening, hence as to why his behavior was as poor as it was. However, this one roll became the exception to the rule. His roll to hit, highest number rolled on disadvantage, 24. Eldritch Blast. Bullseye. As Dorian saw them run up the stairs, Dorian immediately summoned an Eldritch Blast into his hand, shooting it straight through the tavern, hitting the Fire Genasi. And as soon as it hit the Fire Genasi, it hit with such force that it pushed him through the wall of the building. And not only that, as soon as it pushed him through the building, he was also hit with a little bit of a special quirk of the Fire Genasi. See, when Fire Genasis experience heightened emotions, such as anger, they flare up. Literally. He was shocked from being hit by this blast, meaning that he radiated quite the fiery explosion for just a small second. Enough to put the tavern on fire. Dorian, however, did not care. Dorian noticed that he hit, turned around, and was walking away. Just before this happened, Sam was sitting back at the house near Aunt May. As a matter of fact, sitting behind the house and looking at the stars, just simply having a cozy moment for himself. It was a bit relaxing, even though the town was struck with drought as it was. But he was not alone. He saw a boy, a crippled, frail young boy, with a wooden stump for an arm and a wooden prosthetic for a leg. A weak-looking boy. He didn't mind him too much. Until the boy, a little while later, wanted to jump off the barrel he was sitting on. However, he did it incorrectly, and broke the wooden leg that he was on, causing him to fall to the ground. He tried to rise, but it was very difficult for him. and immediately Sam went over to help him up. Sam helped him and carried him up the stairs, and as they walked, Sam talked with him. He learned that he was not feeling too well. He had had this injury for quite some time now, and he was quite tired of this village. He hoped to one day leave it, but he knew he wasn't going to. And ever since, he had been looking at the stars in hope for just a little sign that things one day could be better. He talked about a friend that he was a little bit envious of, a friend that he had not seen for 2 years. The guy was indeed melancholic, but Sam tried to raise his spirits and did that the best way he could. The guy talked about how his life had been shit up until this point due to the injury and had put most of his dreams in the gutter, and as such there was little he could have done about it. However, Sam wanted him to try and think from a different standpoint. Try and see the damages for what they were, but also try and move past them. Try and find something else that could maybe rekindle that feeling of life. For even though it was a very permanent damage and very annoying one at that, he wanted him to try and feel something different than anguish. This was a speech that got to the guy, and he actually looked to Sam with a smile and said, "You know what? Maybe you're right." He looked happy, not as melancholic as he had been looking when he sat down on the barrel, and now he was actually looking decently happier. He appreciated what Sam had said, and they both exchanged names. And his name was Taran. Taran simply thanked Sam for helping him up to the attic where he lived, and closed the door behind him, thanked him for a good talk. Sam felt a little bit better having talked to the guy and potentially actually raised his spirits. And it was at this point that Sam heard the explosion and immediately rushed as quick as he could towards it, even using spells so that he could get there faster. Meanwhile, the fire genasi alongside with the tiefling were eyeing each other. The fire genasi said he didn't want this fight, but the tiefling didn't care. He immediately readied another eldritch blast, and a magic duel started. They started throwing fireballs and eldritch blasts at one another, trying to dodge and weave out of each other's paths, making it most of the time. They only managed to cast a few spells until Lazuli had run out from the fire and stood right in front of the fire genasi, stopping Dorian from shooting another eldritch blast. He took down his hand, unreadied his eldritch blast, and turned and continued to walk. Lazuli quickly turned around to the fire genasi and told him, "I need to help him. Trust me for just a second, please." The fire genasi said, "Go ahead, but I don't think there's anything you can do." Still, she wanted to try. She ran over to him and tried to talk to Dorian. Asked him what was wrong with him. What was he doing? But he didn't respond. He didn't say anything. He looked at her with the most deadpan look he had given her since the day they met. She did not know what to say to him. She tried, she shook him and begged him to say something, but he wouldn't. He simply turned around and wanted to continue. But as soon as he turned around, a fist flew into his head. It was Sam. The fist hit him so good that he simply decked to the ground and was unconscious. Sam immediately took him and carried him away. Lazuli wanted to follow, but felt heat rising from behind her. Looking back, she saw now that the tavern was engulfed. The fire genasi tried to lit out the flames, but he had a hard time doing it considering who he was. He still did his best and asked Lazuli for help. Lazuli went over to conjure forward water to rain over the building and try to light it out. Everyone seemed to make it out of the tavern at the time, but she couldn't see any other people. However, she heard someone inside the tavern. As she was trying to light out the fire, she asked Ifrit if he could run back in and see who was there. He ran into the fire and came back just a minute later, holding a man who was whimpering and crying. He didn't look wounded, but it was hard to see. They worked together and continued to light out the fire as well as they could, until eventually most of it had died down. But by this point, there was little to save. The man in question turned around and looked at the tavern and started to cry even harder, even scream. This was the owner of the tavern, and Lassie recognized him. This was Taran's cousin, Taran's last living family member. The young man, who was not much older than Lassie herself, was broken. He started to cry and started to unveil everything. He recognized Lassie and immediately started saying everything. This was the last that they had left. This tavern was all they had. The little income that they could make. And it had become less and less over the course of the drought. It was hard for them to try to keep up. And Taran was very weak. He could barely feed him anymore. The little money that they had, they split amongst each other so that they could buy little provisions that they could afford to try and help not only themselves but the tavern in whatever little way they could. And now their only main source of income was gone. The tavern itself was practically beyond repair. It was as if someone had delivered a massive axe wound to the entire structure, going straight through the roof and important balks. The roof, on some occasions, had even caved in onto the floor, breaking several bottles and stands and whatnot, and the little place that was actually located above, in the attic, was also completely ruined. This place was beyond repair. This place was indeed Taran's and his cousin's last resort for any form of income, so that they could feed themselves, clothe themselves, or do anything. And hard as the times were, this thing wouldn't be replaced. They didn't have the money for it. They were done. Lassie felt terrible. Lassie simply hugged him and they went back together to where they both lived. And as they walked back, she continued to try and apologize for what her friend had done, supposed friend, who had caused it all. She tried to say sorry. She tried, but even she couldn't manage. And eventually, she just broke down and started crying herself as they walked back. At this point, they were not but a mess, all three of them. The fire genasi, the water genasi, and the cousin was making their way back to the attic where Taran and the cousin lived. They made their way back in tears. Once they made their way up, they stopped crying. Taran's cousin turned around and looked at Lassie. With eyes so dead, he might as well have been lying in the grave at this point. He asked her the one question that he wanted an answer to before he would go through that door. What am I going to say to him? Neither Lassie or the fine genasi could in good honest faith answer that question. And so with the question unanswered, he looked to the ground, opened the door, went in, and closed. Lassie and the fire genasi went down. Sam, whilst this was happening, had carried Dorian back and thrown him into a bed inside of the cart. As soon as he landed in said bed, he puked all over himself. Sam didn't care, simply closed the door and left. Sam was sitting outside the cart and looking at the two of them. Sam was not certain what to do, and neither was they. The village had fallen quiet again. Lassie and Sam did not know what to make of it, and decided that they would go back and see what they could do. But it was not now to be done. It was way too dark. They would have to wait until sunrise. And with the little sleep that they got, they woke up to a misty morning with no sun what to speak of. And as early as it was, No one could have blamed it. At this point it was probably 5 in the morning. Sam was the only one that was in any way, shape or form up and about. Lassie was sitting alone outside on the porch. Sam didn't go over to her. He went his merry way to the tavern to assess the damage. And just like the damage was last night, it was not savable. While it could have been seen clearly even that night that it couldn't be salvageable, this just confirmed it. The daylight that poured over it showed that there was little to nothing that could be done. The thing had to essentially be built from nearly scratch, as it was believed. Sam decided that he would try and go and find a carpenter. So he went around to see what he could find. Sadly, there wasn't much to see. The mist was quite thick, and no one seemed to be awake at the time. The smell of smoke could also be felt across the place, with that of dried wood. Sam, however, noticed another thing. Looking around, he noticed the attic in question, where he had helped up Taran last night. He saw a tall figure standing near the window. Sam sighed and decided to go up to them. Sam went up the steps and knocked on the door. No answer. Simply silence, besides that of creaking wood, similar to that of floor creaking in an old house. He knocked again, but still no answer. And again, the floor was creaking, but, well, no one came. Sam walked down with heavy steps, and as he walked, he heard another creaking sound, this time of a wooden door. He looked behind him and saw that it had opened, but only a little. The door wasn't even properly closed. Fearing the worst, Sam turned around, got back up, opened the door, and found both Taran and his cousin hanging from the roof in 2 nooses. They took their lives in the night. Sam ran over to them as quick as he could and cut them down. They were cold. They'd been hanging there for hours. There was nothing he could do. They were gone. Sam carried both of them to their bed and put them in the bunk bed and put the sheets over them. And as he went out, he hit the door closed shut really hard. He was downright furious. He went down with heavy steps, and as he went down, turned his head to the right, where Lassie was sitting on the porch. She looked up, and Sam did not dare to meet her gaze for longer than a second. He broke off his gaze and walked towards town, not to find a carpenter this time, but to find a priest. As he made his way, Lassie stopped him and asked how they were. He simply told her, "Don't go up. Please, don't go up." But Lassie became extremely worried. She broke free and ran up. Sam tried to run after her to try and stop her, got her at the stairway going upwards, but she broke free again and ran up, only to run into the room, where she saw the cut noose and the 2 bodies in the bunk beds. Lassie broke down in tears and shrieks, unlike that you had ever heard before. She was broken. Sam did not follow her. Sam instead ran towards the nearest priest and located him, and asked him to come with him and told what had happened. The priest was shocked as soon as he said it and brought 2 nuns to help them out. Casks were rolled out and went to the household. While Sam was gone, Lassie was on the floor, weeping and nearly broken. But it was at this point she also recalled something. Those nightmares that she had had 3 days before arriving. Those were not simply nightmares of repressed memories. They were visions. Visions from Nox. Of terrors to come. The familiar building that was on fire, that wasn't her home. It was the tavern. The familiar hand that was reaching out from the rubble, that wasn't her mother's. That was Taran. This was not a nightmare. This was a prediction, a vision of the future. A vision that Nox foresaw. And the one who brought it all to happen was Dorian. The most unlikely dread and terror that could happen had just happened. Her best friend, killed at the hands of a man whom she believed could redeem himself. A man that she had learned to trust over the course of this time, who had turned his back at the 11th hour and not cared. Taran had died because she believed that Dorian could do better. She now understood, and she was devastated beyond repair. This was indeed the straw that broke the camel's back, and Lassie could not stop shrieking and crying on the floor, even when the priest arrived, and Sam. He tried to carry her out, and did his best to do so. She struggled, but as broken as she was, she had little strength to actually do so, and was carried out. As soon as they came down the stairs, Lassie simply ran away. Lassie ran back inside the house, into Aunt May, and woke her up. She tried to tell her what had happened, but it all came out as gibberish. She couldn't speak properly. She just cried and hugged her. It was so far gone. She didn't make any sense anymore. And Mary was so worried, but she just hugged her and listened and tried to calm her. It was not going to be possible. Sam, on the other hand, took a heavy sigh and looked towards the door that led to the cart. He was going to have himself a word with Dorian. And as for Dorian, he was awake. Dorian started remembering what had happened. But there was nothing he could do. He didn't walk up, he didn't leave the bed. He simply lied there, in his own vomit, feeling as if though he had betrayed the only one that cared for him, which is exactly what he had. Dorian felt lost, irredeemable even, and his dying god tried to speak to him, to try and have him redeem himself, to try and speak him back to sanity, stand for what he'd done, and fix it. But Dorian would do no such thing. Dorian did not deserve a chance for redemption in his own mind. And so, the god did something. He made a portal, a small portal, that he took Dorian into, where they spoke in his own realm. The god tried to convince him that there was still an opportunity for redemption, that everyone deserves a chance if they have the ability. And Dorian had the ability. He just had to let it happen. But he didn't. He didn't have enough strength. He knew he wasn't powerful enough to do such a thing as bring them back from the dead. His god was also dying, and would not have enough strength to do it. Dorian thought that it was over, and it was at this point a familiar voice spoke to him. His dead wife. The soul of his dead wife was kept by the Leviathan, and walked out to him, and tried to speak to him, reach out to whatever there was left in him that still was the man that she knew was a good person. Try and have him see that there was still hope. There's a chance you can do good, if only you show you're willing. But he gave up. He had done. He didn't deserve it. He had simply wanted to lie there and await his death. So she lied down with him and tried to soothe him. This agitated Dorian massively, and he tried to get her off. Like that of mist, she simply reformed on him and continued to reform on him. She tried to hug him and silence him, and tried to sing the song that they had sung together to their children. But it wasn't enough. It didn't work. And Dorian was slowly breaking even more, until eventually he threw shatter onto himself. And the only reason that he survived that blow was because the Leviathan threw him out of the realm just in time to save him. But as he threw him out of the realm, he threw him right out by the open door to the cart, where Sam was standing, waiting. Sam tried to speak to him, have him stand trial for what he had done, but he wouldn't listen. He simply lied there and said the same thing he said to the Leviathan. He did not deserve redemption. He deserved to be killed for what he had done. Sam, however, was tired of him. Sam did not like Dorian previously. He thought he was full of himself, but he did not believe that he could go to this kind of length. To be so full of himself that he wouldn't even stand trial for what he had done. He would simply allow them to come there and provide mob justice. But Sam did not want to take that. Sam grabbed him by the horn and pulled the tiefling out the cart, and then took his ass out to the open fields. Lassie, who was by the window and crying, noticed this. She saw what they were doing, and that's when she ran out. But by the point that she had run out, Sam had thrown him to the ground, right in the open field, and started beating 7 days of shit out of Dorian. He was beating him for all the times that he had done this stuff. He was beating him for all of the things that he was so tired of Dorian for doing. Dorian was not a good person in Sam's eyes. But he wanted him to at least acknowledge what he had done, to the point that he could at the very least stand up and stand trial. But he wouldn't. Sam beat him within an inch of his life. And the only reason he was beat within an inch of his life was because Lassie came to his rescue, trying to scream at Sam to get off him. But she had not much in the way of a voice left. They were more like goose screeches at this point, as broken as her voice was. She tried to get him off, failed the first time, and he continued to beat Dorian. But she managed the second time, and pulled him off. Dorian was on the ground, bleeding. Lassie went over to him, and tried to have him understand one last time. But there was nothing that she could do. He was gone. The person that she knew subsided himself to the fate that he thought he deserved. She bowed her head at this point and rose up. Suddenly, something happened. The sky began to darken. Clouds started to gather. But one of the clouds separated, and light streamed down onto Dorian. A blue light. The light in question talked to Dorian so that others heard. It asked him, "Are they dead?" It was the Leviathan, now speaking so everyone could hear. Dorian simply looked up to the light and started to laugh, at which The Leviathan lifted him up with telekinetic powers. And he continued to laugh. And so the Leviathan slammed him onto the ground and screamed, "Are they dead?" And it was at this point something happened with Dorian. Dorian understood something. Dorian recognized something. Dorian understood the meaning in his question, "Are they dead?" Yes, they were dead. His family were dead. Dorian realized at this point that what he was fighting for, the resurrection of his family, was not worth it, for he didn't want it. He needed not to raise them back, he wanted the dead to lie. They were losses, not to his own fault, but due to circumstance. He wanted to bring them back from the dead. They had been dead for 6 years, and over the course of that time, he had not let it go. 6 whole years had passed, and Dorian could not see. He had been blinded by his own drunken foolishness. But he now understood. The dead should lie. The living should not take their place. Dorian was constantly living in anguish every single day since his wife's death, because that was all he was obsessed with. He had not seen a new path, for he had not chosen one. He had simply locked himself on that he has to resurrect his wife. And what would he gain out of it? He didn't even know what he would do as soon as they were back. Would things go back to normal? They never would. 6 long years has passed since the day she had died, and he had not even tried to let her go. And by this point, he was contemplating it. Not only that, he understood why it was worth doing so. His wife's death was not Dorian's fault. His wife's death was due to circumstance, not to any fault of his own. He couldn't have saved her. He did his damnedest, but he couldn't. And he wallowed in self-pity for thinking that he was the fault she was in the ground. But it wasn't. He understood now. They are dead. Let the dead ones lie. But Taran would not die. That would be a memory, always living with him, always haunting him, unless he sought redemption, for that was his fault. Dorian stood up, looked at Lassie, and for the first time in a very long time, she saw a genuine spark in Dorian, a will, a drive, and sorrow, genuine open emotion, something that she wanted to see. And now she saw it. Dorian looked at her and said, "I will do everything to bring them back." Despite the sorrow, a small smile emerged on Lassie's face. As sad as she was, this is what she wanted him to say. She wanted him to care for his actions, and he was going to do the right thing. He walked past Lassie and looked towards Sam, and then towards the village. And that's when they saw an angry mob forming their way, coming towards them. It was everyone from the tavern last night, and more. An angry mob had formed, screaming murderer. They wanted Dorian dead. Dorian would have accepted that just a few minutes ago. He would even have embraced it. But now he wanted to try and redeem himself, not for his sake, but for their sake. And for the first time in a long time, Dorian had a genuine goodwill towards the people that he didn't even know. But he did it because of his actions. And because of that, Dorian got an offer from his god. His god said You need to make a miracle, and I can make miracles. Just let me." And with that, Dorian understood exactly what he meant. His god was dying due to a lack of followers. He could not conduct miracles because of a lack of faith. He looked at Sam and asked him to help him. We need to make these people believe in Leviathan. Sam did not need any more encouragement. Without a word, he turned around and walked towards the crowd. He was furious. He walked and pulled out his sword. Then he jogged. Then he ran. Then he blinked in front of them. And so he boosted his voice with strength he didn't even know he had from the bottom of his heart to all tell them, "Stop!" And that was enough to cause the entire mob to freeze in front of him. And in that moment, Sam started speaking. "I know why you are here. I know what you want. Haven't you seen enough death for one night? Hasn't there been enough tragedy?" But the crowd cried out, "He murdered them." "I know what he did," said Sam, "and I know what he should deserve for it. But this is different. For he has a power, a higher power, that can get him back. What we need you to do is believe." "Leviathan," he said, and pointed his blade towards Dorian. "Show them." And so, in a flurry of motions from Dorian, he summoned an effigy of the Leviathan. The last of his power pulled into one last-ditch effort to convert them. And in one fell swoop, they all fell to their knees as he appeared before them and prayed in earnest. Their sorrow, their sadness, their genuine will to see them alive again fueled their Leviathan. He felt their emotions. He felt their cries. They wanted them back, and they wanted Leviathan to do it. They prayed for him to do it. And with this prayer, with these people that stood on their knees, 250 people, with Lashley, with Sam, and even Ifrit among the crowd, they all bent down onto one knee and prayed in earnest. And so the Leviathan bowed his head, and a storm gathered around them, a cyclone around the entire crowd. And so he began to conjure up a storm, a cyclone surrounding all of the people. It got faster and faster, and the heavens above started to light up more and more, until eventually the storm reached a maximum climax. And from outside of the storm, 2 coffins rolled out in front of the crowd. And with one roar like that from a deep-sea creature, the Leviathan rose his head. And from the sky, 2 spears fell from the heavens, similar to the very ones that Dorian had thrown when he did his Eldritch Blast. They fell from the heavens and shattered both the coffins. Wooden splinter flew everywhere, and in that explosion, a mist expanded and erased the storm. Silence fell across the field. For but a moment, all were silent on their knees, bent, not moving an inch. Until the first ones to open their eyes were Lashley and Sam. They looked up. There was nothing but mist around them, and the bowed effigy of the Leviathan looking down at something. And as the mist started to clear, it got dark, very dark. The clouds above were really thick at this point. The few streams of light that reached down were blue, until eventually the clouds started to slowly but steadily open up, and with each cloud that opened their way, it gave more way to the light to come in. And the sky itself reached down and saw the shape of two boys on the ground, moving. She held her breath for but a moment, until she saw who it was. Standing on his own God-given legs, Taran and his cousin were alive. And so the crowd started to cheer. All hail the Leviathan! All hail the Savior! And as they hailed the Leviathan, he disappeared. But as the effigy disappeared, a small roar came. And with that roar, as the clouds departed, drizzle of rain fell from the heavens. And with each drop hitting the ground, the desert cleared. The parched land that was nothing but sand turned into a bed of flowers and grass. Yet again, the place was alive. Life was coming back to the village. Not only to these two boys, but the entire place around where the village was. The fields were starting to grow flowers again. Life was returning. Lasily screamed for Taran and started running towards him. Taran turned his head and saw that it was indeed Lasily. He started walking towards her with a small limp. And that's when he looked down and noticed he had legs. He took another step, and then another, and then another, and then started jogging. It got a little faster and started running. It was clumsy, but he got the pace, and eventually he was sprinting towards his best friend. And so embraced her with his two own arms back on his body again. Taran was not only alive, Taran was restored, and so was life to the entire region. Sam stood up and put his arm over his chest in honor to the Leviathan for the action that he had just done. Taran simply looked into Lassily's eyes for the first time in 2 years. He smiled and said, "I knew you'd come back." And they held in a long-lasting hug. Dorian let his tired arms fall to his sides. He got to see the sight for but a moment, until this bloody mess of a man fell to the ground and fainted, with the last words that echoed in his mind, "Well done, love." And that marks the end of the story. Whew. What a story. What a fucking story. Yeah. This happened. This actually happened in a D&D session that me and my girlfriend and my two other friends were playing. And it played out like this. It was remarkably taxing. But fuck if it was not redeeming at the end. We played this thing for 6 hours, and it was very, very draining. We have had very fun in the campaign, and this was the first very, very real moment that made everyone feel very bad. It was to the point where nearly all of them cried, actually. Even I fell a tear or two, because it was just so fucking special, that which just had happened. And what can I say? It really, really was. And I gotta say, I did not expect this. Because here was the thing. This happened with dice rolls and decisions made on part of the characters in question. This all came out because of their own actions. And it's a very wholesome story at the end of the day. The reason it was this wholesome is because we continued, because we were very drained by the time that they had been found hung. So it was very difficult to continue, but they still did, and we pushed through to the point where this eventually happened. And it wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the fact that the dice rolled just right, I rolled to check if the crowd would be stunned. They were. I rolled to check if they would actually listen to Sam of his speech. They did. And if they actually would pray in earnest. They did. So, everything considered, it was just a perfectly built-up story in that sense. I didn't roll if they would actually pray in earnest, but I did roll to see if they would actually listen to what he said and bent down and prayed, and they did. And, oh boy. This session was remarkably taxing. It was very fun and very, very harrowing. It was so close to become not a team party kill, but more like a team party dissolve. Because, here's the thing. I talked to Dorian's player later, and he said that if things hadn't gone the way they had, Dorian would have not only snapped, he would have just given up. He would have turned to become the worst villain the world would have ever seen, because it was so broken. If it was the fact that his god would have left him if he didn't follow what his god had said. He would have broken off and become the worst villain the world had ever seen. And that'd be very tragic, because most likely the other two would kind of also just fuck off. Lastly would go back out into the world and see if she could find any new purpose, if even possible at this point, whilst Sam would also just try and probably do the same. Yeah, everything considered, it just rolled very well. And, we have had a lot of fun with this campaign. We are still continuing this campaign even. It goes onward to this very day. It's been doing so since April of 2020. So everything has been going onwards. And we even have 2 new players joining the campaign this Saturday. And hopefully from now onward. And I also want to say why this is so special to me is because this is the very first D&D campaign I've ever done. I've never DM'd before, not properly in any way, case, shape or form. So this was very special that this got to happen. So, thank you everyone so much for watching. And as you can understand, by the way, this was very harrowing. This was very scary in its sense. Because we thought this would just end us on a very bad note. But no, it didn't. And also, Nox. Who can forget that? I did tell my girlfriend that, well, hey, he just fulfilled his prophecy, because that's what it was. It wasn't a sight into the past. It was actually a sight into the future. And whilst I try and make things move in that direction, it kind of did so naturally. I didn't have to do much. So that was very lucky. Yeah, lucky. And it made a fucking good story. So, thank you everyone so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe and share the video around, as it will help me a lot. And if you cried, tell me in the comments. I know you did. And please, like if you cried. Subscribe if you cried. Because we sure as fuck did when it happened. Thing before we leave, though, is I want to say a huge thanks to my Patreons for sponsoring this video and continuing to sponsoring me in turn, because it's been very helpful, surprisingly so, and during these times I can't overstate how appreciative I am, really. There is going to be a new video coming up soon, when, don't really know, probably next week. We'll see what goes down. I'm doing these as good as I can. But, thank you all for watching. See you all next time. Cheerios.